Lot may have been 60, 70 years old at this time even. But nonetheless, they start having a problem. And they both agree that there should be no quarreling among them. And in the last verse, verse 7, it mentions the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in this area at that time too, which means if Abraham and Lot are quarreling and not getting along, if there's any problems with the natives that are local to the area, what's that going to mean for Abraham and Lot if they're not getting along?
Well, they were not nice people, so if they are divided, then they could be easily overcome.
Yes, very true, very true. So they decide to make a decision, and beginning in verse, of course I turn off all these lights so you can see the screen better, it makes it harder for me to read. Verse 8, so Abraham said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine. For we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked up and saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole land, the plain of Jordan, and settled out towards the east. The two men parted company. So, as Abraham and Lot are discussing, I keep calling him Abraham, at this time his name is still Abram, but they're still discussing this issue, and they're trying to decide which way to go, where they should park. And I had this picture up last week, and what this picture illustrates is, you can see there's water down there, there's rivers, and there's vegetation. This is the plain of the Jordan that runs through the middle of the country, kind of to the east a little bit. And you, oops, didn't mean to do that. And you can see up here, there's hilly land, and this is taken from an elevated position too. So you got hills on this side and this side, and the plain runs down through the middle. Very well watered, just like Lot said. It's very lush, very fertile, but also there's a few interruptions in here. The Dead Sea is further down to the south, and we're not sure exactly where this picture was taken, but this is the plain and how it looks when you're out there, and it kind of winds and twists a little bit as the Jordan River does. I don't know if this would be classified as part of the Jordan or not. I don't know if it's south of that or north of it, but nonetheless, this is what Lot and Abraham may have saw, and Lot looks out and goes, where do I want to send my flocks? Do I want to go up in the hills? And you can see it's much drier up there. Or do I want to go down here where it's lush and fertile? Which one would do my flocks better? Which one would you pick? Probably the lush and fertile. That's what he does. Abraham says, no, you're not. That's what I want.
No.
What does he do? He says, fine, take it. So he didn't want any quarreling. Abraham wasn't concerned about his well-being with his herds and flocks. He knew the Lord would take care of them. But he compares it, though, it's interesting because he compares the plain of the Jordan as being well watered. It's kind of like the garden of the Lord. What is that? What's the garden of the Lord?
Garden of Eden?
Yeah, it's the Garden of Eden, and that's over in the Euphrates River Valley, which is way east of this area, which is what it was very fertile, very lush. It was also in the basin of a river too. In most areas in the world where there's a large river, the land surrounding the river is usually very lush, very fertile. So originally, remember, they were from that area. Abraham and Lot came from Ur, which is right in that fertile valley of the Euphrates. So they know that area very well, and he remembered that. He also mentions too, like the land of Egypt. Now, what river would we be talking about in the land of Egypt?
The Nile.
Yeah, it's the Nile. So they were just there. So he remembered how lush and fertile that was, and so he must have taken a liking to areas like that, and he decides that's where he wants to go. But there's something kind of cryptic here towards the end. He says, he wanted to go to the land of Egypt towards Zor, and this is verse 10. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. What does that mean? This was before, when he's referring to this area. We'll come across that later on when we look into this issue a little bit more. But Lot does choose to go to this area, to the plains of the Jordan, and the two-part company here. Any thoughts or questions at this point?
Yes. Abram, we know where he ends up, but I get a little lesson from Abram and his wisdom in this account.
Mhm.
He considered his relationship with his nephew more important than the property.
Yes.
Yeah, we know he has issues later on, you know, with Sarah and such, but this guy's not toxic. Toxic people place things above people.
Very true. Yeah. Good side note. That's the kind of guy Abraham was. That's why God picked him. All right. I'm going to begin reading again in verse 12. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan. And if you get on a map here, get this correct. Yeah, this is the Sea of Galilee up here. This is the Dead Sea, right here. This is what is called the Valley of Siddim, S-I-D-D-I-M, right in this particular area. And it's highlighted up here once again. And you can see the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Adamah is down here. So notice this area right here is called the valley. Not called the lake, it's called the valley. You might be thinking, well, what does that mean? And there's a meaning behind it. But nonetheless, right in these areas, across this area, this is where Lot decided to go for the most part, down in here, in this particular area. Abraham decides to go over here, and this is more mountainous and hilly. That's where that earlier photograph was, and this was the other side of those mountains right here that when we were looking at that photograph. So Abraham is up in this particular area. Here's Shechem. That's an area he spent a lot of time in. And then there's kind of Salem is Jerusalem. Originally, that's what it was called. But Ai and Bethel is kind of like right here in this particular area here. So this is where he went right after there, and his herds and flocks were in the highlands or the hilly areas. Lot was down here. So, and Hebron is over here too, so the name Hebron will come up here a little bit also. So, Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, verse 12, while Lot lived in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. Now, this location of Sodom, oops, wrong button again. Oh, boy. Way back. Okay. There we go. Sodom, this is, notice it has a question mark after Sodom and Gomorrah, because they really don't know for sure where these cities are at. We'll explain that a little bit later on, but somehow Lot lives in this area, and he's close to where Sodom was at this particular time in the Valley of Siddim. It was a very low area. Matter of fact, this is the lowest place on earth, elevation-wise, on land, that is. Now, the Marianas Trench in the Pacific is the lowest place on earth, but that's 8 miles underwater. But this is the lowest point on land on the earth is in the Valley of Siddim in this particular area. And so this means this area right here is a land area with vegetation and people living in the Valley of Siddim. So as I read on here, notice it says in verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Now we're not going to get into that quite yet, but he's given you a hint of what's to come. Reason these hints are here is because of who the author of this book is. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. And how much after the fact is the time of Moses versus the time of Abraham? How much time is there in between the two men?
100 years.
It's 600 to be exact. Well, not exact, but approximately. 600 years between the guys. So you're going to see hints here and there where you can tell the author knows something about the history, and we can go back to verse, 11, where he mentioned this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. That was verse 10, where he was talking about the garden. That's a hint of something that's going to come in the future. And also, too, the hint of the wickedness of the people of Sodom. So just remember, that's why those hints are there, is because the author is 600 years in the future of this, and he knows how all this turns out. So, so let's begin now in verse 14, I think it was, if I can read that. I can read because it's dark here.
Just before you get there, you notice Moses writes here and he says Lot sets his tent near Sodom and Gomorrah. Psalms 1 says, "Blessed is the man that walks not, stands not, sits not." You see that progression. You're walking, you're standing, now you're sitting. So you're in a settled position. Here we see Lot near Sodom and Gomorrah. When God comes to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, where is Lot?
In the city.
Living in.
Later on, it'll say that too in these
Yeah.
passages here. He was actually in the city.
In the city now.
I don't know if he was there all the time,
But
but I think he was going back and forth.
yeah, so you can see that progression, how we can easily progress from where we should not be to where we are.
Would it be safe to say that Lot is on a slippery slope?
Yeah,
I think so at this point. He hasn't gone full blown, but
yeah,
his thinking isn't real clear right now at this point, and he's doing something that he's going to end up regretting later on. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring would be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abraham moved his tents and went to live near the great tree of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Now, I don't want you to get confused with the name here of this M-A-N-R-E, and if you look back in chapter 12, there was also a great tree mentioned, the tree of Moriah, M-O-R-E-H. That's a different tree location, so there's more than one area where these people were. And actually this Mamre in verse 18 is actually a person. It's the person who lives in that area, and we'll see that later on in chapter 14. So that's the name of a person that lives near these great trees, near Hebron, which is, I thought I had that on the map.
It's right on the right,
Left of the
to the
balls.
left, it says it.
Oh, yeah, there it is. There's Hebron. So that was the area that he's talking about here. So Abraham moved a lot. I mean, he was all up and down these areas right here for the most part. This is where the Philistines, the Amorites, and all the others lived. They live more on the coast. Lot's here, Abraham's here, and the other ones are over in this particular area. This area over here is the beginning of the Euphrates area, which this is actually a desert over here, but the Euphrates comes in on the other side. So now that we got our geography straight. Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is going to begin a chapter where there's a regional power struggle, unrelated to Abraham. But it's going to affect Abraham and Lot both. but it is a regional power struggle between kings who are trying to control other kings, basically. The battle between empires, which is very common throughout the entire history of the world. So beginning in verse 1, there's parts of this I may skip a little bit because I get kind of annoyed sometimes trying to figure out how to pronounce these names because I'm not sure all the time. At this time, Ephrael, king of Shinar, Artak, king of whatever that Elisar, Kedalam, however that is, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Gaum, went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Sinab, king of Admath, Shemder, king of Zebulun, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. All these later kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim in the notice parentheses, the Salt Sea. For 12 years they had been subject to Kadamar, but in the 13th year they rebelled. So these 5 kings. Notice here too these blue lines. This is the route of the 4 kings are from Mesopotamia or somewhere north of there, somewhere up in this area originally. They were from this area. We don't know for sure where all these cities were, because you're talking 4,000 years ago. So it's hard to know where some of these ancient cities came from. But it's believed originally the dark blue, it was their path that they came down from up north, because these people were supposed to be paying tribute to these guys up here, which means they came in, it's like a protection thing. You give us this amount of money and goods, and we'll leave you alone. You don't give us the money and goods, we're gonna come in and take it all. So that was basically the attitude they had. So people had a choice which way they want to go. These guys down here decided, we're not paying anymore. They're getting tired of it. So that provokes a reaction from the kings up north, and they decide to come down and they attack a lot of these areas down in here and all the way down, and then they finally come down to this area, which is the valley of Siddim, and you can see the cities that are there, and they have a war in the valley of Siddim as time goes on. There's a battle there, and notice it says, verse 3 and 14, it says, these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, parentheses, the Salt Sea, which is also called the Dead Sea. Now wait a minute. The Dead Sea's up here. Why are they calling this valley of Siddim the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea? The Salt Sea is more of a description of what it's like.
Lowest point is it because it's the lowest point?
It is low, but that's not exactly, it's hard to understand what he's getting at until you know the history of the area. This particular area is a land area. You can't have a battle on the ocean unless you got boats or something. They didn't. So there was a battle right here between the 4 kings against the 5 kings. So they have a battle here, but it's called the Salt Sea.
I wonder, like the Salt Lake City, they get a lot of salt from this Salt Lake. When it dries up, there's a lot of salt there. I don't know if that would be the same concept. If it flooded, you'd get a lot.
Partially. I'm gonna show you. This is
bitumen pits. Is that why it's? Is it the bitumen pits that are there?
we'll get into that too. Yeah, that's part of it, because those tar pits are there in the Valley of Siddim. But if you look at a later map, a much later map, and this is a much later map, here's that Salt Sea again. Notice this peninsula land sticking out. You see that peninsula land sticking out here?
Yeah, right there.
That's it right there. So if you look at this one, you still see that peninsula, but what's below the peninsula now? Does that look like a valley to you?
Water,
It's water.
flooded out.
It flooded out. This land is now underwater. This is part of the Dead Sea. This water is much shallower. The Dead Sea is very deep. It averages like 600 feet in depth. But this area, they say it's like between 6 and 10 feet of water, much shallower. So later on in history, the Valley of Sidon becomes a sea. It gets flooded completely, and it's been that way for 4,000 years now. It's almost dried up a few times because it's so shallow. But nonetheless, that's the area where the battle was held. Does it make any wonder why it's so hard to find Sodom and Gomorrah? It might literally be underwater. They don't know for sure where Sodom and Gomorrah is, even to this day. They're still guessing because they literally could be underwater, but we don't know for sure because it's hard to look in those areas.
Jeff,
Yes.
if the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, could he have just wiped out any trace of it?
That is certainly true. But I'm going to give you more information later on when we get to Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a lot of archaeological evidence that has been uncovered in the last 50 years. There are some very interesting things. And because there's a lot of people, historians, who are anti-God, who say none of this ever happened. There was no Sodom and Gomorrah. There was no 5 kings against 4 kings. They question all this stuff. Wait till they find the archaeological evidence. It's gonna.
No Hittites.
Yeah, well, there's all kinds of stuff. They've been proven wrong every single time. As a matter of fact, a lot of times it's almost a blessing when they try to refute the Bible because somebody ends up finding a proof that they're totally wrong. It makes people go, whoa. It's powerful information sometimes. So, nonetheless, we can see that this battle begins to happen and they go after each other, and I'm going to skip over to verse 8 in chapter 14. Verse 8 begins, then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, these are all in the Siddim Valley, the king of Zobin, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. Zor is in the far south of that sea area, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Sidon against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and the other 4 kings. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Sidon was full of tar pits, which is something Terry just mentioned, which they are still there. Many of them are underwater now, but there still is some on the coast surrounding the area. There are still tar pits still there to this day, and you can see them online. I'll show you pictures of them. So, let's see, verse 10. Now the valley of Sidon was full of tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled into the hills. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abraham's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living where? In Sodom. Okay, once he was out, now he's in. So notice I have mentioned before also too that if you don't pay tribute, what do? They come in and they take everything, including the people, and they become slaves of you. So it was a tough situation when you were put in these situations. You pay or you lose everything. Abraham's nephew Lot, because of his close association with the people of Sodom, because he lived in the area, he gets carried off too by these marauding kings. And that creates a problem. So, any questions at this point? All right, let's go now down to verse 13. One who had escaped and reported this to Abraham, the Hebrew. Now Abraham was living near the great trees of Mamre, the Ammonite. See, remember I mentioned before that Mamre is a person? This is the person. He was an Ammonite. That's his name, Mamre. A brother of Eshcol and Aner, who were allied with Abraham. So this Mamre Eshcol and Aner were all obviously what to Abraham?
Allies.
Allies. They were friends. They had a good relationship with these people, that they were three brothers, and this is the area they lived in, and obviously they had some kind of alliance to protect one another from the crazies like the four kings in the area, because who knows, what could happen at any time. You had to be prepared those days, just like nations today have armies, just to be prepared in case somebody decides they want to take all their stuff. So these three individuals are allies with Abraham. Verse 14, when Abraham heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan during the night, divided the men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hoban north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions together with the women and the people. So at this point, go back. So at this point, these guys came down, and we're not sure if they came down this far or they went straight into this area, but nonetheless, they were attacking all kinds of people, the Ammonites and other people. So eventually they come here. They probably came here last because this is the most powerful area. Everything else was more outlying communities. This would have been the hardest one to tackle. So they come here and they decide to attack at this particular point. And as time goes on, Abraham hears about it. And these four kings, after they defeat them, this checkered blue is their path to go back home with all the people and goods that they have conquered. Abraham, on the other hand, was in Hebron. He heard about this, and his path is the red path. So he hears about this, that these guys went up this way. As soon as he hears about it, he gathers what?
Men.
Yeah, how many? 318, and that's just his men. It doesn't say anything about the three brothers, but they were allies of his, and it sounded like they were in on this too. So they may have contributed, depending on the size of their clan, a significant number of soldiers also. It could have easily been over 1,000 people, soldiers, that were trained to go after these four kings and retrieve the property of all those individuals. So Abraham, being a little bit behind, you hear about the news late, follows their path up here as they're going along. And he gets past Shechem and Hazar, and he gets to Dan. Notice there's a big star right there. That's where they do battle. This is where he wins the war. And also too, it mentions, Damascus, north of Damascus. And Damascus is even farther north. So I'm not sure exactly where Damascus is, but it's somewhere up in this area too. So, and you can see the dots continue because they leave. And we don't know exactly where they went after the battle. So Abraham and his soldiers are very successful in this battle. And they were able to defeat these four kings. And since these four kings had powerful armies, because they defeated a lot of people and large armies here, why do you think it was such a quick battle? What was Abraham's strategy?
Probably attack it, right?
He did. He attacked at night, and they attacked in different groups. They surprised them. Chances are, too, when an army has defeated all these people and they're heading back home, do you think they're real concerned about security after they just conquered everybody? Probably not. It was at night, and they're probably, speculating, they're probably half drunk, the whole army is. And just carrying on and heading back, and all of a sudden, boom, in the middle of the night, this horde of soldiers comes after them, and they are very quickly defeated, and they were able to get back everything they had, and they probably lost a lot of soldiers even before Abraham got to them. Their army was probably reduced quite a bit from previous battles. So they were easily defeated by Abraham, and they pursued them and chased them until they totally got out of the area. probably with the idea to make sure you never come back here again. So verse 17, after Abraham returned from defeating Kelmar and the kings aligned with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Sheva. That's the king's valley, and that particular area, is that my next slide? Yeah. This is the King's Valley, which is over in this area right here, which is north of this whole area. But notice Abraham's coming back. And he's coming back to send people back to their homes. In this particular, Jebus, that's Jerusalem. That was its earlier name. And there's Bethel and Ai, where Abraham goes often, and he was in Hebron also too. But as he's coming along down, bringing everybody back, they come to the Kidron Valley or the King's Valley, and this is where they meet somebody who comes from Jebus or Jerusalem. So, verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abraham, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. So this is kind of a significant event in end of chapter 14 here. And as they're heading back, Abraham meets who? This guy comes out to meet Abraham.
King of Sodom.
King of
Sodom.
Salem. King of Salem. And which is Jerusalem. So, what kind of person is this person? How's he described?
He's a priest and a king.
He's a priest and a king. Is that unusual? Yes, it's very unusual.
Yeah, there's only one other person who's a priest and a king,
Oh, really? Who might that be?
you know,
Who was that, Peter?
Jesus.
It was Jesus. He's described in the same way as Melchizedek is, and there's a lot of similarities between the two. Notice when he comes to him, what does he give him?
Bread and wine.
He gives him bread and wine. I read one commentary where I kind of laughed after I read it. He said he was probably giving them bread and wine because they were probably very hungry. This guy has a ton of people and food with him already because he took back all the goods. I doubt Abraham and his men were hungry. They had plenty. So then why did he give them bread and wine? Think of what Peter said. What might this be a symbol of?
The body of Christ and the blood of Christ.
Yeah. There's been a lot of speculation throughout history that this is symbolic of the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine. So before I go too far with that too, in Hebrews, a lot of times the best way to describe some actions of some individuals in the Old Testament is to look in the New Testament, and God will tell you exactly why, in some cases, why certain things were done a certain way. Melchizedek has been called a type of the Son of God. What is a type? A version?
It's a foreshadowing.
Foreshadowing? What is foreshadowing?
Foreshadowing means, we just got done studying
I
this
know
in the
you did.
ladies' class.
I figured I'd guess some people would know.
Yeah, so it means it kind of gives us a glimpse of what is to come, but it's always less than what is to come. Like what is to come is always greater.
Okay, and why do you use the word foreshadow as an illustration to your point? Because you're on the right track.
All I can think of with that is even in literature, they foreshadow what is to come. So
Yes.
it's always kind of a glimpse.
Okay.
And it's called types and shadows, right? So this is a type, and then the actual is the shadow. So
Yeah,
foreshadow then would be something that comes forward.
Before
right.
the shadow.
So Melchizedek is a type or a foreshadowing. Now, in literature, who's the antitype?
It's the real person.
It's the real person,
Yeah.
who is
Right.
Christ.
What these types do, what they do for us is reinforce the validity of Christ, because God's plan is seen way back then, already in action.
Yeah,
So when he does come, you're prepared in a way to recognize him when he does come.
yes. You can see the planning of God from the beginning of time for these issues to arise, and he brings forth these types to show us what is to come in the future.
The other foreshadowing here is obviously that Abraham offered to him. I think maybe Hebrews touches on that,
It does.
but it's basically saying the law is gonna give to something greater, in that sense, is what
Yes.
we're saying.
So the shadow is Melchizedek, Christ is the real person who's casting the shadow to Melchizedek.
Who is the type, but an antitype is the opposite,
Yes,
so.
it's the reality. The antitype is the reality. Jesus is the antitype.
It's a strange word, it doesn't mean anti.
I know,
Okay.
it's,
Doesn't mean against.
yeah, it's kind of a play on words, I
Yeah,
guess.
it's kind
Doesn't mean
of
against.
Right. Right,
Anti means over and against something,
yeah.
but in this case, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's against.
Okay, I didn't remember that.
So, notice also too in the Bible, there's the story of Joseph. Is Joseph described in the Bible as a type of Jesus Christ? Because if you look at his story, you might say, hey, he's a type too. But does the New Testament ever say that he's a type? It really doesn't. But that's where some of the people who examine literary stories too mention Joseph is not a type of Jesus Christ, but he is an illustration or a parallel account that sheds light on Christ and his ministry throughout thousands of years later that actually happened. So he's an illustration, but he's not a type. There's a lot of similarities between the two, but he's not in the typology study of being somebody who is actually a type. So any questions on the literary definitions of what these things mean?
Comment, when we studied chapter after chapter in this book, over and over, the author would say, you know, it is not mentioned in the Bible that this is a type, but the similarities are too strong to ignore.
Yes.
And he said that over and over again, so
Yes.
there's not that many that are really a direct, statement
Mhm.
that they're a type.
Just because it doesn't say it's a type, doesn't mean it's not a type.
Right,
You could be right.
Because there's inferences that we have to take into account, right? And I kind of agree with the fact that there are types there, and it doesn't say they're a type, okay? Moses is called a type, okay? Melchizedek is called a type, but still, Jesus' ministry and his priesthood is after the order of Melchizedek, which makes him actually more than a type.
I would, in this particular case, I think you might be right, because some
So-
of the ways they describe Melchizedek in Hebrews makes
Right.
me think what you're saying might be true.
So we, even though it may not say that an individual is a type, doesn't mean that they're not portrayed. So we're types of Christ right now, but has anybody called me a type? No. The church is a type of Christ.
Mhm.
All right, and so that's the problem we get into when we start putting a singular word into play that may not be used all the time. All right, so I kind of have to say I'm in agreement.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic to look at, all these things that foreshadow the coming of Christ later on. I mean, these illustrations, you just can't ignore them. I mean, they're very profound and very much to the point. So, we got a few minutes,
There we go.
No, you don't.
maybe not. We're gonna look at some scriptures next week. First mention of this type, Melchizedek, in the Old Testament after this particular point is in Psalms 110. We'll look at that, and then we'll go on to Hebrews chapter 7, and we'll look in there a little bit about the specifics of it. And just, some of it is just verbatim, what is mentioned right here in the book of Genesis too. So it's kind of an interesting topic, and it seems like the New Testament writer of the book of Hebrews, who was probably Paul, really gets into some deep stuff. That is, like Peter said, some of the things Paul wrote are hard to understand. Some of the stuff in Hebrews is definitely hard to understand, because when you start getting into the types and the illustrations and all that stuff, it gets a little complicated. But then again, I guess God is complicated. So it's not as simple as some people like to make out. So we'll see you next week.
She's beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
But she's a little too young.
She was back then.
Yeah, she's nice. Nice, still too young.
She was constantly asking me.
Yeah, that's a lot of.
She was constantly asking me all these questions, even about